The Xeric Dominion had subjugated countless worlds. To them, war was not an art nor a tragedy. It was a calculation, an inevitability governed by superior tactics and overwhelming force. For centuries, their empire had crushed all resistance, assimilating or annihilating those who stood in their way. When reports surfaced of a developing species on the fringes of known space, one still bound to a single planet, the generals barely acknowledged it. Yet protocol dictated an assessment. And so, they came. High General Thalzir, his crimson-scaled crest gleaming under the sterile glow of the human conference hall, stood flanked by his two most trusted advisors, strategist Vorike and tactician Corvel. They observed the human delegation with veiled amusement. The Xeric had fought civilizations spanning entire sectors of the galaxy. These beings, these humans, still waged war with crude kinetics and nuclear fire. The human representatives, led by General Alexander Grant, stood with an air of forced confidence. Beside him, Admiral Victor Henshaw and Commander Elias Carter maintained their poise, though their eyes flickered with something the Xeric generals recognized. It was not fear, at least not entirely. It was a calculation of their own, an assessment of the situation. Thalzir respected that in a way. Futile though it was, these men still sought to measure the odds. "We understand you have come to assess our military capabilities," General Grant said, his voice measured. Thalzir's mandibles curled into what, among his kind, passed for a smirk. "Assess? No, General. We are here to confirm what we already suspect." His voice carried the weight of countless campaigns, of worlds that no longer resisted because resistance had been proven meaningless. "And what is that?" Grant asked, meeting the alien's gaze without flinching. "That your wars are nothing more than chaotic struggles of primitive minds. You lack the discipline of true warfare. You fight like feral creatures, bound by emotion rather than strategy." Tactician Corvel let out a dry, chittering laugh. "Your greatest triumphs are measured in body counts and destruction. Strategy? Logistics? Galactic-scale maneuvering? You have none of it." Grant remained unshaken. "You judge us without understanding us." "There is little to understand," Vorike scoffed, folding his arms. "We have conquered species who mastered war far beyond your capabilities. Your history is nothing but a collection of skirmishes, loud, brutal, and ultimately insignificant." A long silence stretched between the two sides. Then Grant spoke again, his voice even. "You claim to be superior warriors. You dismiss our history as primitive. Fine. Read it." The Xeric delegation exchanged glances. It was a pointless endeavor. There was nothing these humans could show them that would alter their view. Yet the sheer boldness of the challenge intrigued them. Thalzir exhaled slowly, as if indulging a lesser being's request. "Very well. We shall see what your history has to offer." Human data interfaces were crude but functional, and within moments, the Xeric generals found themselves submerged in the annals of Earth's past. At first, they skimmed with detached amusement. The wars of antiquity, fought with sharpened metal and wooden projectiles, were little more than tribal disputes in their eyes. The Roman legions, the Mongol hordes, the samurai of Japan, all fascinating in their own way, yet pitifully obsolete. But as they read on, something began to shift. The advent of gunpowder, the rise of global empires, the Napoleonic Wars. Each era demonstrated an unnerving adaptability. Where other species stagnated in their methods of conquest, humans evolved. The Xeric watched as Earth's conflicts escalated in scale, complexity, and brutality. The Industrial Revolution transformed battlefields overnight. Machine guns, artillery, trench warfare. Humanity refined war at a pace that disturbed them. Then came the 20th century. They, once reclining in boredom, now leaned forward. The First World War was a bloodbath unlike anything he had expected. The idea of an entire generation wiped out in the span of years, not by planetary bombardment or orbital sieges, but by sheer attrition, was grotesque in its efficiency. And yet, instead of breaking, humanity learned. It adapted. It innovated. And then came the Second World War. A deep unease settled over the Zurich delegation. Thalzir's fingers twitched as he read of Stalingrad, of Midway, of the firebombing of entire cities. The Zurich were masters of conquest, but they had never encountered a species that turned war into an existential struggle. Humanity did not simply fight for control. It fought to erase threats, to outlast them at any cost. When the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, silence fell over the Zurich. A single device, annihilating an entire city in an instant. And then, days later, another. Not an act of conquest, but of finality. Humans did not just win wars. They ensured their enemies ceased to exist as threats. Vorkay finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. They developed methods of destruction faster than they developed methods of control. Corvell exhaled slowly. They do not merely wage war. They evolve through it. Thalzir's jaw clenched. He continued reading, moving into the Cold War era. Humanity did not stop. It did not pause to reflect on the horror it had unleashed. It built bigger bombs, more efficient methods of annihilation. And yet, it also devised strategies to prevent war, as if understanding its own destructive potential and fearing it. A race that could destroy itself, but did not. A species that, despite its brutality, fought wars not just for domination, but for survival, for ideology, for resources, for reasons beyond what the Zurich had ever considered. By the time they reached the modern age, the Zurich generals sat in a stunned silence. "You judge us," Grant's voice cut through the quiet, "but you've never faced a species that fights like we do. We are not the strongest. We are not the fastest. We do not have your technology." He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "But we learn, we endure, and we win." For the first time, Thalzir saw it. The thing he had dismissed as arrogance before. It was not bravado. It was certainty. The Zurich Dominion had fought many enemies, but never one like this. And suddenly, the idea of conquest no longer seemed so inevitable. Silence hung over the room like the aftermath of an orbital bombardment. The Zurich generals sat rigid, their reptilian features betraying no emotion. But the subtle shifts in their posture, the flick of a claw, the tightening of a mandible, spoke volumes. The glow of the human data terminal cast pale light on their hardened faces, reflecting the images of war still playing across the screen. High General Thalzir had spent centuries mastering the art of conquest. He had orchestrated planetary invasions, shattered fleets, and crushed rebellions with cold precision. He had witnessed the destruction of entire civilizations, watched species fall into ruin beneath the inexorable advance of the Dominion. He had never felt doubt. Until now. His eyes traced the words detailing the wars of Earth's modern age, the conflicts that had redefined an entire species. His mind recoiled at the sheer scale. The Zurich waged war to control. Humanity waged war to survive. And there was no limit to what they would do to ensure that survival. Strategist Vory exhaled slowly, his taloned fingers tightening against the polished surface of the conference table. "They annihilate their own," he muttered, almost to himself. "They burn their own worlds, their own cities, to deny an enemy a foothold." Tactician Corvell, normally the most cynical among them, now sat in a rigid stillness, his gaze locked onto the images of trench warfare, of napalm engulfing entire forests, of nuclear fire consuming cities in a single blinding instant. "They kill not just to win," he murmured. "They kill to ensure their enemies never rise again." Thalzir said nothing. He continued to read. He read of Stalingrad, where men fought in the ruins of a shattered city, devouring rats and corpses, refusing to surrender even when all logic dictated that they should. He read of Vietnam, where a technologically superior force was bled dry, not by overwhelming firepower, but by an enemy that refused to fight conventionally, that turned the very jungle into a weapon. He read of the Cold War, a conflict of shadows and strategy, where the threat of absolute annihilation became the foundation for an uneasy peace. And then he read of the modern age, of asymmetric warfare, of nations fighting enemies who did not wear uniforms, who did not hold territories, who struck from the shadows and melted into the populace. This is not war, Voike whispered. This is something else. Thalzir finally spoke, his voice measured but taut with a tension none of them had heard before. This is adaptation. Voronake turned to face him. They do not fight with strength alone. They fight with ingenuity, with deception, with cruelty. His voice, once laced with scorn, now carried an edge of unease. We have crushed species that resisted us, but we have never fought a species that changes with every war it fights. Corvel, whose expertise lay in tactics and counter-strategy, rubbed a clawed hand over his jaw. They do not rely on technology to win. They use it, yes, but it is not the source of their strength. Their true power is in their mindset. They do not fear war. They embrace it. They grow from it. He gestured toward the screen, where footage of urban combat played. Humans ambushing superior forces in streets turned to battlegrounds. They have mastered the art of turning every weakness into a weapon. A heavy silence followed. For the first time in his long, decorated life, Thalzir felt the cold grip of something foreign slithering into his mind. A slow, creeping realization that the Dominion's calculations had been flawed. They had always assumed that superior force, superior numbers, and superior technology would grant them inevitable victory. But what if they were wrong? What if, for the first time, they had encountered an enemy who could not be overwhelmed, only endured? What do we do? Voronake asked, his voice lower than before. Corvel leaned forward, his golden eyes narrowing. There are only two options. Either we annihilate them now, before they leave their planet, or we prepare for the day they come for us. Thalzir did not respond. His mind was still racing through the implications. The Dominion had never faced an enemy it feared. It had never needed to. But the more he studied humanity's wars, the more he understood the truth. This species was a paradox. It was savage yet calculated, reckless yet disciplined, fragile yet unyielding. They did not simply fight wars. They became them. And war was the one thing the Xeric had never imagined they could lose. The room was no longer a battlefield of words, but a silent graveyard of certainty. The Xeric generals sat motionless, their cold confidence eroded by the weight of revelation. The humans had shown them something no other species had, a history not of conquest, but of endurance. War was not a mere tool for power in human hands. It was a force they wielded with terrifying mastery, reshaping themselves with each battle, growing sharper, stronger, more unrelenting. High General Thalzir's mind churned, cycling through strategies, calculations, probabilities. A direct invasion? Impossible. The moment the first Xeric warship entered orbit, humanity would adapt. They would study, counter-retaliate. Even if the Dominion burned every city to ash, some would survive, retreat into the shadows, rebuild in secret. That was what unnerved him the most. The humans did not merely fight to win. They fought to outlast. Strategist Voight exhaled sharply, his talons tapping against the table, a rhythmic staccato of unease. We should end them now, he growled. Strike before they reach beyond this planet, before they become a threat we cannot contain. His words carried the weight of pragmatism, but his tone was laced with something else. Fear. Tactician Corvel shook his head slowly. You assume we can end them. His voice, usually edged with arrogance, was quieter now, more measured. But how? They will not surrender, not in the way others have. Destroy their cities, and their armies will go underground. Cut off their leadership, and another will rise. Take their resources, and they will learn to fight without them. How many times has their own kind tried to wipe them out? His golden eyes flickered with something almost reverent. And yet they are still here. Thalzir closed his eyes for a long moment, his mind reaching across the vast knowledge of the Dominion's military history. Every campaign they had fought, every species they had crushed, every empire they had brought to its knees, none of them compared to this. These humans, they did not need time to evolve. They evolved through war itself. Voronake's mandibles tightened. We are the Dominion, he spat. We have stood unchallenged for millennia. You would have us retreat? Thalzir opened his eyes. Yes. The single word sent a ripple of disbelief through the room. Corvell studied him, silent for a long moment, then nodded once. Vornake, however, slammed a fist against the table. You would have us fear them? Thalzir turned his gaze to him, and for the first time in centuries, there was no condescension, no certainty, only the quiet weight of a commander who had looked into the future and seen something he did not wish to face. I would have us respect them, he said. Vornake bared his fangs, but no further argument came. He had read the same history. He had seen the same horrors. He knew deep down that Thalzir was right. The Xeric Dominion had never turned from a fight. Never once had they encountered an enemy they deemed unworthy of war. Until now, the decision was made. The assessment team would return to the Dominion with their report. No war, no invasion, no contact. Earth would remain untouched, unchallenged. As the Xeric generals rose from their seats, preparing to leave the humans behind, Thalzir cast one final glance at General Grant. The human had not spoken since they began reading. He had simply watched. Grant met his gaze, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He knew. Somehow he knew. Perhaps he had always known. The humans had won a war they never even knew they were fighting.